There's an almost imperceptible moment in adult life when something begins to unravel inside. It's not a visible collapse. There's no public crisis, no explicit drama. You continue functioning. You continue delivering results. You continue to be seen as someone who made it. But internally, a question begins to surface with unsettling frequency. How is it possible to earn so much and still live in fear? If $100,000 a year represents success, why do so many people who reach that level feel they are merely teetering on the edge? For decades, this number was presented as a final destination, not as an intermediate step, but as the point where tension would lessen, where accumulated effort would finally transform into tranquility, where the future would cease to be a constant source of worry. The promise was simple and powerful. Get here and life becomes lighter. It wasn't just about money. It was about dignity, predictability, and emotional security. This idea spread almost invisibly. It was repeated in family conversations, reinforced in educational settings, and used as an implicit reference in the job market. The number became a symbol, a sign that someone had crossed an important boundary of adulthood. The message was clear. Upon reaching this level, you would be protected. But when many people finally arrived there, something unexpected happened. Relief did not come. Instead, a more sophisticated type of pressure emerged, a discomfort difficult to explain, a fear that doesn't scream but never silences. People who followed the expected path began to realize that there was no real room for failure, that the constructed standard of living demanded constant performance, that any interruption, however small, could cause a domino effect difficult to contain. What's most disturbing is that this discomfort didn't stem from excess. It didn't come from extravagant choices or a luxurious lifestyle. It came from the basics, from the essentials, from the cost of simply existing in a world that has become more expensive continuously and silently. Housing has ceased to be an affordable shelter and has begun to consume a growing portion of income. Not as a choice, but as an imposition. Transportation has ceased to be a convenience and has become a rigid necessity. Food has lost its predictability. Health has ceased to represent security and has become a permanent financial threat. The money comes in, but it doesn't create profit margins. It sustains the structure. That's all. There is something deeply disconcerting about looking at a salary considered high and realizing that it offers no real protection, that it doesn't create slack, that it doesn't guarantee peace of mind. It's like wearing armor made for an ancient conflict in a completely new scenario. You are not helpless, but you are not safe either. You live in a constant state of vigilance. This state changes the way life is lived. You plan everything. You calculate risks. You anticipate problems. Not because you want to grow, but because you can't afford to fall. Work ceases to be about building and becomes about maintenance. Earning money ceases to be about progress and becomes about defense. The focus is not on advancing, but on not retreating. This way of life produces a weariness that doesn't appear in the body, but in the mind. It's the exhaustion of knowing you're doing well and yet still feeling unstable, that you're above average and yet still fear the future. This internal conflict generates something even more corrosive: guilt, because complaining seems unfair. Questioning seems excessive. After all, there are millions of people in much worse situations. This thinking pushes discomfort inward. It silences important conversations. It causes financial anxiety to be treated as a personal failing, when in fact it begins to manifest itself collectively. When organized, disciplined, and responsible people experience the same kind of insecurity, the problem ceases to be individual behavior. It becomes structural. Perhaps the mistake lies in how we've learned to think about money. We've turned a number into a symbol, and a symbol into absolute truth, as if it were outside of time, as if it were immune to inflation, social changes, and the new demands of modern life, as if $100,000 today were equivalent to $100,000 decades ago. But they are not, and this difference isn't just mathematical. It's emotional, psychological, and social. The number remained the same, but its weight changed completely. Expectations grew. Responsibilities multiplied. The margin for error almost disappeared. What once allowed us to breathe now only prevents collapse. There is also a silent transformation in the meaning of success. Before, earning more meant, at some point, slowing down. Today, it often means accelerating indefinitely. More hours, more pressure, more dependence on a single income stream, more fear of losing what has been achieved. Success ceases to be freedom and becomes constant vigilance. This dynamic creates a cruel irony. The higher you climb, the more fragile you become. Achievement turns into an elegant prison, functional on the outside, unstable on the inside. Perhaps that's why so many high-earning people feel trapped. Trapped by a cost of living that doesn't allow for real choices. Trapped in a city they can't leave. Trapped by financial commitments that require constant upkeep. Trapped in a future that depends on factors they don't fully control. And then comes the question that few dare to ask aloud, but which begins to echo internally with increasing insistence. What if that number was never enough for the world today? This question is uncomfortable because it dismantles an old narrative. It forces us to admit that the map used to guide important decisions may be outdated, that perhaps we are pursuing goals that no longer fulfill the function they promised. This is not pessimism, it's clarity of thought, because when a number loses its symbolic power, it ceases to be objective and becomes merely a raw value. And continuing to treat that value as synonymous with security can be one of the most expensive traps of modern life. We haven't even gotten into the cold, hard calculations, the taxes, or the percentages yet. We're talking about expectation versus reality. The silent frustration of realizing that the game has changed, while the rules we were taught have remained the same. And this is just the beginning. Because when we set aside nostalgia and face the real, current, and unforgiving numbers, the scenario becomes much clearer and much more frightening than it seems at first glance. It is at this point that the illusion truly begins to crumble. And when mathematics enters the scene, it doesn't ask for permission. It simply reveals what has always been there, waiting to be seen. After the illusion begins to crumble, an almost physical need arises to check if the discomfort is real or just an impression. It is at this point that many people do something inevitable. They sit alone, in silence, and begin to put the numbers on the table. Not out of curiosity, but out of unease. They open a spreadsheet, an app, or a notebook. There is a silent hope that, by organizing everything, the feeling of tightness will disappear, that mathematics will bring relief. But, for many, the exact opposite happens. Imagine someone who earns $100,000 a year. In the collective imagination, that number carries weight. It sounds like stability. It suggests comfort. It seems far removed from insecurity. But reality begins to change, even before the money reaches the account. Taxes come into play first. A significant portion disappears automatically. The number that seemed large begins to shrink without discussion, without choice. The gross amount transforms into something much more commonplace. Next comes housing. Not a luxurious house, not a high-end apartment, just a functional, safe place, close enough to work so that each day doesn't become exhausting. This basic choice, which should be simple, consumes a huge portion of monthly income, not out of extravagance, but because the market has pushed the cost of normal housing to a high level. Rent or mortgage payments don't impress with luxury, but with their constant burden. Then comes transportation. Car, public transport, or a combination of both. Installments, maintenance, fuel, insurance, fees. Nothing extraordinary, just the cost of continuing to move. Food comes next. Not expensive daily meals, but weekly groceries that seem to increase in price without warning. Common products require comparison. Small cuts become a habit. The shopping cart gets lighter. The final amount remains high. Health emerges as a constant reminder of fragility. Plans, co-payments, consultations, exams, medications. Even when everything is fine, the cost exists. And when something goes wrong, the impact is immediate. It doesn't generate panic, but it generates tension. A kind of permanent attention that never switches off. Add to that basic bills, communication, insurance, education, financial commitments made along the way. Not impulsive decisions, but choices made based on the promise of future stability. Everything seems reasonable in isolation, but when placed side by side, the result is surprising. What's left at the end of the month isn't comfort. It's a minimal margin. Sometimes almost none. It is at this moment that mathematics ceases to be neutral and becomes emotional, because it doesn't discuss intentions. It doesn't evaluate effort. It only shows proportions. And what it reveals is frightening not because of excessive spending, but because of the delicate balance. Everything works, but any change can destabilize everything. This experience happens silently in thousands of homes. A couple who earns well but postpones having children because it's not the right time. A professional who stays in a stressful job because they can't take risks. Someone who refuses an interesting opportunity for fear of initial instability. Small decisions begin to be filtered by a constant, often unspoken question. What if something goes wrong? What's most unsettling is realizing that this doesn't only happen in extreme situations. It happens in organized lives, in planned routines, in stories that, from the outside, seem solid. That's where the uncomfortable surprise arises. Earning well doesn't mean being protected. There is also the cumulative effect of time. Year after year, small cost increases erode purchasing power without causing an immediate shock. It's not a sudden crisis. It's a slow erosion. You continue living, continue paying for everything, but you feel you need to run faster and faster just to stay in the same place. Salaries occasionally rise, but expenses rise along with them. The feeling of progress weakens. At this point, many people try to take the blame. They think that maybe they are mismanaging things, that maybe they need to cut more, that maybe the problem is discipline. But when the cuts start to affect the basics, this narrative loses its power. It's not about waste. It's about structure. Mathematics then reveals something even more unsettling. There is no real safety net. There is no comfortable reserve that allows one to make mistakes with peace of mind. There is planning, yes. There is responsibility, but there is also dependence. Dependence on continuous stability. Dependence on a constant income. Dependence on a system that does not allow for long pauses or unexpected deviations. This changes our relationship with time. Vacations cease to be complete rest and become something calculated, evaluated, limited. The future ceases to be a space of possibilities and becomes something that needs to be constantly protected. Dreams are postponed. Important decisions are pushed aside, not for lack of ambition, but for lack of leeway. The suspense in this part of the story isn't in a dramatic event. It's in the gradual realization, in that moment when someone closes the spreadsheet, takes a deep breath, and realizes that, despite everything, there's no sense of security, that the number that seemed large only keeps the machine running. It doesn't buy peace of mind. It buys continuity. And then an even bigger surprise emerges. When talking to other people, the same story repeats itself. Different professions, different cities, different lifestyles. The pattern is the same. The discomfort is not isolated. It is shared. This realization changes everything. Because when the mathematics of many lifetimes points to the same place, it ceases to be an individual problem. It transforms into a clear sign that something deeper is happening. And this raises an inevitable question, one that is becoming increasingly troubling. If $100,000 only keeps everything running, what happens when something goes off script? What happens when stability fails? This question doesn't have an immediate answer. It remains unanswered. And that's precisely what makes it dangerous. Because from that point on, it's no longer possible to pretend that the number by itself guarantees security. The math has spoken, and it has made it clear that the problem isn't a lack of effort. It's the real cost of living in a world that has changed faster than our financial benchmarks. But what makes this situation even more unsettling is not just the present, it's what it indicates about what comes next. Because if things already seem tight today, what will happen tomorrow when everything gets even more expensive? It is at this point that the discomfort ceases to be merely financial and begins to transform into something bigger, something that directly affects how people live, choose, and build their future. And that's the part of the story that almost no one is prepared to face. After mathematics reveals the fragility of the present, something definitively shifts in the perception of those who are paying attention. The problem ceases to be merely about how much comes in and how much goes out at the end of the month. It becomes about invisible forces pushing everything in the same direction, regardless of how much effort someone puts in. A deeper, almost unsettling unease then arises. What if this constant squeeze isn't just a bad phase, but the normal functioning of the current system? For a long time, inflation was treated as a distant, technical, almost abstract concept, a number cited in economic reports, graphs, and political speeches, something that seemed not to directly affect daily life. But, in practice, it has ceased to be an isolated event and has become a permanent presence. It doesn't arrive all at once. It acts slowly, continuously, squeezing purchasing power month after month, year after year, without announcing its arrival. The most dangerous thing is that this pressure is rarely accompanied by an immediate feeling of crisis. People continue living, working, paying bills, making plans. Everything seems normal on the surface. But beneath this normality, the cost of maintaining exactly the same standard rises steadily, sometimes almost imperceptibly, sometimes more evident, always enough to reduce the margin of error. If everything seems normal, why does the feeling of insecurity only increase? Because, as prices rise, the concept of minimum acceptable living also changes. We're not talking about luxury, but the basics required to function in today's world. Living close to work is no longer a convenience. It's a necessity. Having stable internet is no longer a differentiator. It's an obligation. Access to healthcare is no longer an extra security measure. It's a basic requirement. What was once comfort is now a minimum condition. And when the basics go up, everything else goes up with it. In previous decades, winning well meant creating distance from risk. It meant room for error, to react spaced to adjust decisions. Today, in many cases, it simply means keeping up with the rising cost of the game. You don't advance. You maintain the same level. And when something goes off script, the fall happens too quickly to be cushioned calmly. Does it still make sense to measure success using benchmarks created for a world that no longer exists? There is a silent trap in this process. As the cost of living rises, people feel pressured to accept conditions that, in another context, they would refuse without hesitation. Longer working hours, less free more constant demands, greater dependence on a single source of income. The fear of losing stability begins to guide decisions that should be strategic. This fear rarely manifests as panic. It appears as excessive caution, as continuous procrastination, as conservative choices disguised as responsibility. Little by little, life narrows, and so a difficult cycle is formed to break. To maintain a minimum standard of living, a constant income is needed. To maintain a constant income, predictability is needed. To have predictability, flexibility must be sacrificed. And, without realizing it, freedom is exchanged for a feeling of security that only exists as long as everything works perfectly. But the world rarely works perfectly. This security is fragile because it depends on factors completely beyond individual control. The global economy, political decisions, technological advances, corporate restructurings, issues. Just one of these elements moving in the wrong direction is enough to threaten the entire balance. And here arises a disturbing contradiction. There has never been so much access to financial information, and yet there has never been so much financial insecurity. How can this be explained? Part of the answer lies in the pace of change. The current economic system reacts almost instantly to external shocks. Costs adjust quickly, prices rise quickly, rates change quickly, Wages, however, do not. They adjust slowly, if at all. This creates a structural lag between what is earned and what is paid, a space where insecurity grows silently. Meanwhile, old references continue to be used as a compass. Success stories from the past, advice that worked in a different scenario, ideas that don't consider the increased individual risk. The result is a constant mismatch between effort, expectation, and actual return. This disconnect doesn't just generate frustration, it generates confusion. People sense that something is wrong, but they can't pinpoint exactly where the problem lies. And when the cause isn't clear, the tendency is to shift the blame back to oneself. Perhaps you've already thought that you needed to work harder, get more qualified, take on more responsibilities. Maybe you believed that the next raise would solve everything. Maybe you felt relieved for a few months and then realized that nothing had changed significantly. Why does this happen? Because the system absorbs individual gains with impressive speed. Income increases rarely come alone. They arrive accompanied by cost increases, direct or indirect. Not only because people spend more, but because the surrounding environment adjusts. Rents go up. Services become more expensive. Taxes change. What seemed like progress quickly becomes maintenance. There is also a profound and little discussed psychological factor, the normalization of anxiety. When insecurity lasts long enough, it ceases to be perceived as an exception and begins to be seen as the rule. People adapt. They adjust their expectations. They lower their expectations. They call this maturity, responsibility, realism. But is it really maturity, or just forced adaptation to an increasingly restrictive environment? This point marks an important turning point, because, from here on, the problem ceases to be merely financial and begins to shape fundamental life decisions. Where to live your interests, when to start a family, how much to risk, how much to dream. Money ceases to be a tool for building and becomes a constant limitation. And the higher the income, the more paradoxical this becomes, because externally, everything seems under control. Internally, the pressure grows. There is a silent fear of falling to a level considered unacceptable, not out of basic need, but because of social expectations, invisible comparisons, and internalized narratives of success. This comparison carries more weight than it seems. It creates the feeling that retreating is failure, even when retreating could mean more freedom, more time, or better health. Psychological cost of change seems too high. How many important decisions in your life have been guided more by the fear of losing stability than by the desire to gain something better? Another rarely discussed element is the transfer of risk. Many costs that were previously partially absorbed by companies or governments have been pushed onto the individual. Health, retirement, education, financial protection. Everything has become a personal responsibility. This creates the illusion of control, but also multiplies the emotional and financial burden. Earning $100,000 today doesn't mean you're prepared to absorb all those risks. It only means you have the resources to finance them for now. And for now is the word that changes everything. Because when the system demands that individuals bear increasing risks alone, the feeling of instability becomes permanent. No matter how organized someone is, there will always be the impression that something might slip away, that something might collapse without warning. This is the emotional basis for what many feel is newly broken. Not the immediate lack of money, but the absence of lasting security. And the more this pattern repeats itself, the clearer it becomes that the problem isn't a specific number. It lies in the relationship between income, cost, risk, and expectation. The most unsettling surprise is realizing that many people aren't failing financially. They're simply trapped in a model that demands more and more, transfers more and more risk, and delivers less and less sense of security. And this leads to an inevitable question, which gains strength as the story progresses. If the system pushes everyone toward this constant limit, what, after all, is the true definition of being financially well off today? There's still no simple answer to this question, but ignoring it comes at a high cost. Because while we continue chasing old numbers, the world continues to change, and the gap between what seems sufficient and what truly is only tends to grow. And perhaps the greatest risk isn't earning little. Perhaps it's never realizing that the game has been redesigned and continuing to play as if nothing has changed. There's a specific point where the discussion stops being about numbers and starts being about freedom. Not abstract freedom, but the practical freedom to say no, to change course, to make mistakes without everything collapsing. It's at this point that many people realize something deeply uncomfortable. Earning $100,000 doesn't mean being free. In many cases, it means structure. That's cost operation. Imagine someone who earns that amount and still can't go 6 months without working. Not because they live in luxury, but because everything around them has been structured to demand continuity. Rent doesn't pause. Loan payments don't wait. Health insurance doesn't decrease. Bills keep arriving with mathematical precision. Money comes in every month and goes out at almost the same speed. The standard of living remains, but it doesn't create space. This pattern is not an exception. Research in developed countries shows that a significant portion of people with high incomes would not be able to cover more than a few months of expenses without a salary. This data is surprising because it breaks an automatic association. High income does not guarantee security. Without a real margin, it creates dependency, and dependency is the opposite of freedom. There's a recurring story in this scenario. A well-paid, respected professional with a solid career. They're thinking about changing fields, reducing their working hours, taking a year off to study, or starting their own business. The desire is there. The ideas too. What's lacking isn't ambition, it's space. The risk seems too great because the cost of failure is too high. The income sustains everything, but it doesn't build a way out. This creates a silent paradox. The higher the income, the higher the cost of stopping. The higher you climb, the more expensive it becomes to change direction. Success, which should broaden options, ends up reducing them. Life becomes efficient, but rigid, functional, but inflexible. Little discussed data helps to understand why. In recent decades, items directly linked to quality of life have grown above average inflation. Housing in urban centers, education, health, personal care, and mobility have become proportionally more expensive. These are precisely the items that consume a large portion of the income of those who earn well. It's not a coincidence. It's structural. This means that money is not being used to create exceptions, but to maintain access to what is considered normal, living close to work, having adequate medical care, ensuring good conditions for the children. None of this is a luxury, but all of this requires increasingly higher incomes. When the cost of normalcy rises too much, freedom is the first thing to disappear. There is also a profound psychological effect in this process. High-income individuals often associate identity with performance. They see themselves as productive, competent, and responsible. Admitting that they are financially trapped sounds like a contradiction. So the discomfort is internalized. The person continues to function, but feels that something is not right. This feeling intensifies when the environment reinforces constant comparisons. Social media displays images of freedom, people traveling, starting businesses, slowing down. The contrast creates the impression of personal failure. What rarely appears are the external sources of income, family support, hidden risks, or the psychological cost behind these choices. The comparison, even so, weighs heavily. A little discussed fact completely changes the logic of the game. Financial freedom doesn't begin when income rises. It begins when dependence decreases. This means that someone who earns less but has flexible costs and multiple options can be freer than someone who earns a lot and depends on a single, rigid income stream. This reversal is difficult to accept because it challenges the traditional narrative. We have always been taught that income generates purchasing power. In practice, purchasing power comes from margin, not from gross value, but from flexibility. Real stories reinforce this. People with high salaries who, after an unexpected layoff, immediately panicked. Not because of a lack of money that month, but because of the absence of alternatives. Their career was their only foundation. The cost of living didn't allow for a break. The standard of living they had built up didn't allow for a quick reduction. In contrast, there are less visible stories of people with lower incomes but simpler financial structures. Lower costs, fewer fixed commitments, more control over their own time. These people don't live in luxury, but they possess something rare: adaptability. And adaptability is one of the most concrete forms of freedom. Another unexpected fact helps to broaden this perception. In many economies, indebtedness has grown precisely among middle and upper-income families, not for excessive consumption, but to maintain their standard of living. Long-term financing, constant installments, credit as an extension of salary. Debt ceases to be the exception and becomes a tool for maintenance. When debt becomes structural, freedom silently disappears. Each fixed commitment reduces future options. Each obligation limits movement. The future becomes predetermined by past decisions. There is also a status trap. Earning well creates pressure to maintain visible signs of success. Living in certain places, consuming certain services, frequenting specific environments. Even when this doesn't bring real satisfaction, abandoning these symbols seems like a step backward. And so, choices are made to maintain an image, not a desired life. True freedom is rarely visible. It doesn't appear in photos. It manifests itself in the ability to choose without immediate fear of financial consequences. And this ability is becoming increasingly rare, even among those who earn a lot. Therefore, many people are starting to change the question. Instead of how much do I need to earn, they start thinking how much do I need to spend to feel secure. This shift in focus is powerful, but also uncomfortable, because the answer is rarely aligned with the lifestyle one has built. This part of the story exposes a little celebrated truth. High income can be merely a sophisticated form of survival when it is not accompanied by real autonomy. Money keeps everything running, but it doesn't create freedom. And it is precisely at this point that an almost inevitable mistake arises. When freedom seems distant, the instinctive reaction is to seek more money, more income, more performance, more effort. It seems logical. It seems sensible, but this logic hides a dangerous trap. Because if the problem isn't just how much money comes in, but what it takes to keep coming in, earning more might not set you free. It might only tighten the chains even more. And that's where many people, without realizing it, take the next wrong step. When freedom begins to seem distant, the most common reaction arises almost without reflection. To earn more money, the logic seems simple, almost obvious. If $100,000 is no longer enough, then the problem must be that number. The solution, therefore, would be to surpass it, to seek $120,000, $150,000, $200,000, to work more hours, to accept more responsibilities, to climb another rung. This idea is so deeply ingrained that it is rarely questioned. And that is precisely why it becomes the most dangerous mistake on this journey. Many people enter this phase with renewed hope, an anticipated promotion, a larger bonus, a new position that promises to solve everything. In the first few months, relief truly sets in. Bills are paid with less stress. Fear diminishes. There's a feeling that, finally, the problem has been solved. But this relief is usually short-lived. Silently, the cost of living begins to adjust to the new level. New expenses arise. Expectations change. The standard of living rises, almost imperceptibly, and the space that seemed to have been created disappears. This cycle repeats itself with disconcerting precision. Increased income does not create freedom. It creates adaptation, and adaptation, when it occurs within the same structure, only strengthens dependency. The central mistake here is confusing increased income with increased control. They are different things. In many cases, they're opposites. When income grows without structural change, the surrounding system responds automatically. The real estate market pushes towards more expensive options. The social circle adjusts. The expected lifestyle rises. Professional responsibilities increase. Free time decreases. Dependence on that income level intensifies. What seemed like a solution transforms into a more sophisticated version of the same prison. There's a common story at this point. A professional accepts a promotion that brings more status and more money, but also more pressure, longer hours, and greater demands. They know the work will be more intense, but believe it's worth it. After all, more money should mean more security. A few months later, they realize they can't back down. The new standard has already been incorporated. Expenses have adjusted. The mental load has increased. The profit margin hasn't grown. The salary has gone up, but freedom has decreased. This pattern repeats itself because the problem was never just the amount of money received. It was the structure that continuously demands that amount. Earning more within the same logic only feeds a system that was already strained. There is also a profound psychological effect in this process. When someone starts earning more, they feel the need to justify that gain, to work more, to be more available, to accept more pressure, to take more risks. Identity begins to merge with performance. The person stops simply depending on income and begins to define themselves by it. At that point, losing that level of income ceases to be just a financial problem. It becomes a personal threat. Another aspect that is rarely discussed is that higher incomes often come with greater instability. Bonuses are not guaranteed. Goals change. Corporate structures reorganize. The higher the position, the more sensitive it tends to be to strategic changes. This creates a dangerous paradox. Risk increases precisely when dependence also increases. This is how the trap closes. The person earns more, but needs this more to keep everything running. They haven't accumulated freedom. They've accumulated obligation. Each increase makes returning to the previous point more difficult. Each advance reduces the options for escape. Data reinforces this pattern. Studies show that, after a certain income level, salary increases have a progressively smaller impact on feelings of security and well-being. The additional money is quickly absorbed by higher taxes, higher fixed costs, and elevated expectations. The emotional return diminishes, while the pressure increases. Still, the urge to seek more income remains strong, because it feels like action. It feels like control. It feels like moving forward. Cutting costs, reducing dependence, or changing structure requires looking at past choices. Earning more allows you to keep everything as it is, simply pushing the problem into the future. There is also a deep fear of making the opposite move. Lowering standards sounds like failure. Cutting expenses seems like a step backward. Trading money for time seems irresponsible in a world that values constant productivity. Thus, the only socially acceptable direction is upward, even when going up makes things even more difficult. It is at this point that many people realize something unsettling. They are trapped in a race they never consciously chose. They work to maintain a pattern they don't necessarily want, simply because it is formed over time. Each isolated decision seemed reasonable. The sum of them created a dependency. Another recurring mistake at this stage is believing that everything will be resolved when a new magic number is reached. First it was 100,000, then 150,000, then 200,000. There's always a next level that seems, from a distance, to offer definitive relief. But when it's reached, the scenario has already changed again. The cost has followed suit. The pressure has too. This constant pursuit creates a state of permanent postponement. Real life is always put off. After the next promotion, after the next bonus, after the next contract. Freedom is always in the future, never in the present. There's a crucial detail that almost no one considers while trapped in this logic. Earning more doesn't automatically reduce risk. In many cases, it fixed cost de more expensive lifestyles are less flexible. Any setback has a greater impact. Mistakes become more costly. This explains why so many high-income people live in a constant state of alert. It's not inconsistency. It's emotional mathematics. The system demands absolute continuity, and absolute continuity is fragile. At this point in the story, a profound disconnect emerges between effort and perceived reward. The person works more, earns more, but feels less free, less at peace, less in control of their own time. Money, which should be a means, becomes an end. And when that happens, something essential is lost. This part of the journey is uncomfortable because it dismantles the most obvious solution. It shows that the problem isn't just earning too little, but depending too much on earning too much. That the mistake isn't ambition, but the absence of a structure that allows for mistakes, pausing, and choosing. This is where the need for a deeper shift in perspective begins to emerge. Not about earning more, but about reducing dependence. Not about growing indefinitely, but about creating space. Not about running faster, but about getting off the treadmill. This realization doesn't bring immediate relief. On the contrary, it generates a new kind of discomfort because it forces us to question old choices, inherited priorities, and outdated definitions of success. It forces us to admit that the path followed so far may not lead to the imagined destination. But this restlessness also carries something new, something rare, possibility. Because when you understand that earning more isn't the automatic answer, it opens up space for a different question, a more difficult question, but infinitely more powerful. If freedom doesn't come solely from income, where does it truly come from? This is the question that begins to point towards a real way out. And that's precisely why it's so frightening. Getting this far already says a lot about you, because this story isn't comfortable. It wasn't made to please, nor to offer quick shortcuts. It dismantles old promises, exposes modern illusions, and forces a silent confrontation with a hard-to-accept truth. The problem was never just money. It was dependence. It was fragility disguised as success. It was confusing income with security, movement with progress, and effort with freedom. There is an intimate, almost invisible moment when this understanding ceases to be intellectual and becomes emotional. It doesn't happen in the midst of the rush. It doesn't arise while you're busy solving problems or meeting goals. It appears when you stop, when you realize that, despite all the external advances, the feeling of control never arrived, that tranquility was always postponed, that freedom was delayed in the name of a pattern that seemed logical, but was never truly questioned. This recognition hurts. It hurts because it forces you to admit that perhaps you were extremely competent within a poorly designed game, that perhaps you followed rules that worked for another generation in another context. And that's not failure, it's lucidity, a belated lucidity, perhaps, but a powerful one, because only those who see the real problem can build a real solution. The good news is that understanding this completely changes the type of solution that makes sense. The answer isn't about earning more at any cost. It's not about overloading yourself even more. It's not about radically cutting everything or impulsively abandoning responsibilities. The way out lies in something deeper, less glamorous, and much more transformative: rebuilding margins, reducing dependence, and regaining the ability to choose. It all starts with a simple, yet uncomfortable, change. Stop asking how much do I need to earn, and start asking what do I really depend on? Dependence on a single source of income, dependence on a fixed standard of living, dependence on a lifestyle that demands perfect continuity, dependence on external approval. All of this can be mapped. All of this can be adjusted, but only if it is approached with radical honesty. The first practical step is to see your costs, not as isolated numbers, but as commitments that buy or steal future freedom. Each fixed cost is a promise made to your future self. Each installment is an agreement that demands continuity. This doesn't mean eliminating everything or living in scarcity. It means consciously choosing what deserves to exist, what truly sustains your life, and what merely sustains an image. The second step is to build margin before seeking growth. Margin is not a luxury. Margin is oxygen. It's time. It's tolerance for error. It's the ability to say no without panicking. It's getting through a difficult period without feeling like everything is going to fall apart. Margin comes from more flexible costs, reserves and expectations adjusted to the current reality. It grows slowly, but it completely changes the way you live. The third step is to reduce the fragility of your lifestyle. This doesn't mean becoming a professional investor or irresponsibly starting a business. It means decreasing your absolute dependence on a single income stream. This could involve diversifying your skills, finding complementary sources of income, pursuing side projects, or making career choices that offer more mobility. The goal isn't to gain more quickly, but to experience a less severe drop if something changes. The fourth step is to redefine success in a personal, not social, way. Success cannot simply be about maintaining a visible standard or meeting external expectations. Economy, mental health, and quality of life. This requires courage. Courage to disappoint people. Courage to deviate from the expected script. Courage to admit that some achievements did not deliver on their promises. True freedom is rarely applauded at the beginning. The fifth step, perhaps the most difficult of all, is to slow down internally. Even if external life still demands pace, the mind needs to get out of constant urgency mode. Not every decision needs to be optimized. Not every month needs to be perfect. Not every risk needs to be avoided. Living in a permanent state of alert takes a heavy toll, and that toll appears silently over time. This plan doesn't promise quick riches. It doesn't offer magic formulas or absolute guarantees. It promises something rarer and more valuable: consistency. Consistency between what you earn, what you spend, what you fear, and what you desire. It doesn't eliminate challenges, but it transforms your relationship with them. Instead of living trying to sustain everything, you start choosing what truly deserves to be sustained. Perhaps, by applying this, you'll realize you don't need to earn as much as you imagined to live better. Perhaps you'll discover you need less than you thought to feel secure. Or perhaps you'll realize that the real change isn't in the next raise, but in how you organize your life today. All of these conclusions are valid. All are signs of true maturity. The most important point is this: you are not late. You haven't failed. You haven't wasted your life. You simply woke up in a system that changed too quickly. And waking up almost always hurts before you break free. If this video made you feel uneasy, seen, or reflective more than you expected, that's no coincidence. It means those questions were already inside you, just waiting for space to surface. Don't ignore them. Don't put them off. Small, conscious changes now prevent deep regrets in the future. Now, I want to hear from you. If you identified with this story, if you've experienced this conflict, or if you're trying to reorganize your financial and emotional life, share your experience in the comments. If you prefer, you can go so anonymously. This is not a space for judgment. It's a space for clarity and respect. If this content helped you see something new, like the video, this greatly helps the channel continue producing profound reflections like this one. And if you want to see more content that doesn't sell easy illusions, but helps you think better about money, time, and choices, subscribe to the channel. You don't need to solve everything today, but you need to start walking in the right direction. And from now on, you're not doing it alone.